I'm going to talk about system migration with FME, and I'm going to steal a phrase that was brought up on Tuesday, eating our own dog food. So who are we? Concertech Solutions, we're a consulting firm specializing in GIS, engineering, and 3D technologies. We're partners with Google, Autodesk, Safe Software, like Geosystems. We're a Safe Gold partner. We have certified professionals and trainers, and we are ISO certified. So that's just giving you a bit of a background on who we are. Where are we? We're in Brossard, Quebec. We're just outside of Montreal. For those of you who are familiar with the East Coast, we're at that little star right there in the suburbs. So just as an introduction of what I'm going to talk about, FME, as we all know, is a powerful tool for data migration, moving data from one system of data management to another. So the main point that I want to get across today is that we used FME at every single step of the way to perform a data migration from one system of infrastructure management to another. We use FME, obviously, to extract the data we need, transform it, and load it directly into the new format. We also use FME to validate the integrity of the data once the data has already been migrated. Like I said, to recycle the phrase, eating our own dog food, the clients that we did the system migration for do not actually have FME. We were working with, to go on a continuation of the previous presentation, AutoCAD Map 3D Enterprise Solutions. And they didn't know that FME was doing the migration, but we used it internally for ourselves to move their data to a new system. So this is just a picture of beautiful Canadian geese moving data from one place to another. There are different types of data migration, and they present different challenges. One of them that we see very commonly is CAD to GIS. It's basic but common. We see this in all kinds of municipalities and organizations. Data stored in multiple files that need to be brought into a GIS system. File-based to database. So we have a whole bunch of CAD files or any files, and they need to all be consolidated into one database. And inevitably, it brings up the issue of schema. So moving data from one schema to another sometimes is like comparing apples to oranges. It can be a pretty big challenge sometimes. So the case example that I'm going to talk about is Solo Network. And this is a product it's a template or a product that we've developed on top of AutoCAD Map 3D technology. So it's basically a template for infrastructure management, sewers, water, et cetera, et cetera. The reason why we developed this is because we're located in Quebec. As most of you probably know, in Quebec, we operate in French, and we have standards in French, et cetera. So we've developed a Quebec-specific template to manage infrastructure. And we have a number of municipalities who are using this internally. And we had to get them there somehow. We had to get their existing data into AutoCAD Map 3D. And this was the challenge that we took on with FME. So this is what it looks like. We have sewer lines, endpoints, sanitary storm combined, water lines, road center lines, et cetera. And we have a form. It's sort of just to give you an idea of the GIS system that we're trying to get data into. There's the interface, in case anybody's curious. Map 3D. Who here has worked with Map 3D before? More than you thought. So we've done a number of different migrations into Solo Network. In French, we call it Solo Réseau. We've done it with drawing files containing infrastructure data with linked attributes. We've done it with shapefiles containing infrastructure data, and also from other database schemas. We had another product in the past called Munisig Réseau, which we had to bring data into the new system from. Today, I'm going to talk about taking that data that was in the old system and bringing it into the new system. this seems like a maybe not that hard task with FME. One of the reasons why FME was really useful is because, as we know with data, garbage in, garbage out, walking into an organization that has maybe 1 or 2 people in charge of the GIS, you know, they may or may not be GIS people, presents a lot of challenges in terms of the quality of the data. And bringing data into a new system, it's really important to know the data that you're working with and to have good quality data. So FME really helped in managing that. So some of the major differences between the source and the destination, the source, the attributes are stored in the same table as the geometry, whereas in the destination, the geometry and the attributes are stored in separate tables and are related to one another. We went from English to French. That presents challenges as well. And we moved from a simpler schema to a more complex schema, domain tables with character values to domain tables with numeric values. These are all little details that make things a little bit more complicated or interesting, depending on how you want to look at it. So the point of this is that we use FME every step of the way. We used FME to do the schema mapping, to figure out what needed to go where. We used FME to generate those tables for us based on the data that we already have. This allowed us to see what we have, to know exactly what we're working with, rather than going off, oh yeah, I think that we have some tables here. I think, you know, yeah, that's supposed to go to that. So with FME, we can extract and see every single thing that we have in the source data. So that was very helpful. And we used FME, obviously, to build the workspace to transfer data using those files that we created in the previous step. FME to load the data. And we also used FME for validation. So we created validation tables with FME and used FME to actually execute the validation to make sure that the transfer of data was successful. So I have a lot of detailed slides. I'm going to go through them kind of quickly. This is an example of one of our tables that we use for schema mapping. Class solo is our destination table. And the source data tables are sim name. So we use this workspace, this spreadsheet, just a basic Excel spreadsheet, to help build the workspaces to validate the data. Help build the workspaces and also to validate the data after it's been loaded. So this is an example of schema mapping file, Excel file that we used. So we have our from and our to. It's not super complicated. We also have other data in these that talk about the domain names. Not sure I have it there, but we also have the, yeah, so we have at the bottom, we have all the different sheets represent the different feature types. This helped us keep it organized and all in one sheet. And each Excel file actually represented a topic, which is kind of like a feature data set division. So for example, the feature class, in the feature class, AQ canalisation, whatever is in the field type, pipe type, whatever is in the field pipe type will be copied into type canalisation, which is pipes. We also used Excel tables for the domain tables. So we have the source lookup table, the destination lookup table, and the associated attributes. So both data schemas contained domain fields. One of them had characters, the other one had numbers. We had to map that using FME. This is a tiny little workspace that we built to populate the mapping field with this information. This enabled us to make the right connections. You see in the bottom reader feature type, we actually have in the old system a list of all the SP table would be our spatial table, the lookup table, and the join columns. So we pulled out the metadata from the database, put it into an Excel file so that we could properly do our mapping. So after we did all this prep work using FME and Excel files, we created workspaces to read the data, or to transfer the data. So our source is the original database feature classes. This one is just an example of where we're looking at water points, so like fire hydrants, valves, manholes, etc. this was an interesting challenge. In the new database, we have data stored, spatial data is stored separately from attribute data. So we couldn't just push the data in because every time we created a new feature in the database, there was a new feature ID that was generated. So we actually had to generate the ID in FME rather than waiting for the trigger in the database. So we used FME to set off the trigger in the database, give us the new feature ID, so that when we put it into the database, we already had the ID, and that the ID was associated both with the geometry and with the attribute data. So we tag it on right at the beginning to each feature, and then we separate data, spatial data, attribute data. So we use an SQL executor to do that, to run a script to go get the next value in the sequence. We used, this is a way to clean up the data. We found that the data was not that clean in a lot of the cases. We had some random stuff put in there depending on your source and how many controls were on it. You can have any kind of errors or weird formatting. So this is kind of a way to format the dates to test to see if the dates were present, if they weren't present, what kind of format the dates were in, modify that. And then we separate it all out into the different feature types based on the values of some attributes. Some of you might be wondering why we didn't use a schema mapper for something like this. I think for us, because the data was a little bit sketchy, there are some unknowns, there's some surprises, and every step of the way, it was nice to see the result at each operation that we were doing rather than doing some fancy tables, run it through the schema mapper, and see it only at the end. This was a way for us that we like to do it to actually be able to control and see visually. The great thing about this workspace is that you can see all of the features passing through each step of the way and how many, and you can cross-check to see if it is the right amount of features or not. So here we're just tagging on some attributes that the new system needs. Not that important. So as you can see, we have 1 million lines going down into our geometry section. This is where it's not very complicated. We're just taking the geometry from the old one, pushing it through into the geometry table for points, for water points. Because we've attached a feature ID onto the feature at the beginning, each element in the database needs to have a new feature ID. So we transferred the original feature ID into another attribute that's going to make the connection. And then we reset it to 0 so that when the geometry goes in, it gets a new feature ID, but it maintains that connection with the attributes, which is what I was talking about before. So we're doing a lot at many steps. We're doing a lot of interacting with the database and managing the data so that when it goes into the database, it is the way that it needs to be. So for the attributes, just doing some renaming of attributes to change the schema. That part's not that complex. And then for each attribute that has a domain associated with it, we put a separate SQL executor. This makes a very busy workspace, but we kept it all clean with bookmarks and annotations. But what it allowed us to do when we were doing our validation is to go back and see with the little features and the lines how many features are passing, how many of them found a match, et cetera. So this was really helpful to us. Personally, I really love watching the numbers and making sure that they are what we're expecting them to be. So the script for the SQL executor was not very complicated either. We're just selecting the data from the data table, domain table, and replacing it. So the nice thing about this is that it's dynamic. So if the values in the attribute domain, if the values in the domain table change, it doesn't matter because it's going to go get the matching one. Whereas if you had it hard-coded, if there was any change in the database, you would kind of be screwed. You'd have to go into the the transformer and change it yourself. But I probably don't need to tell any of you that. So the results, the data is written to the new schema. The domain values, the proper domain values are copied. And the date values are formatted the way they need to be formatted. And we have the geometry separated from the attribute data. So in one table, we have all the geometries for all the points, and the attributes are all separated into different tables. For example, we have one attribute table that has all of the information associated with fire hydrants. I have a hard time remembering what it is in English, even though I'm an Anglophone. Fire hydrants, or one that has valves, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all separated that way. So the validation workspaces were really important. We were able to use FME to make sure that the data came across as we wanted it to. So how do we know that all the data has been transferred? Well, we used FME to create validation workbenches that read the Excel mapping files, our original mapping files. So we had to make sure that those were clean. And we know that those were clean because they came from our source data with FME. It also queries the old database and queries the new database and does a comparison. The output from our validation workbenches looks something like this. We have our from and to tables, but the most important parts are the counts at the end. For example, you'll see meta date creation has 0 in one, so there's probably a problem somewhere in our workspace for this one. This was really useful for us because, like I said, the data was not totally clean. The clients that we're working with, their ability to fill out the spreadsheets properly and make sure that, their knowledge of the data was sometimes there, sometimes not. It depended on the resources that they had available. Part of the reason why they hire us to do this kind of thing is because there is a lack of resources sometimes. So this allowed us to make sure that there wasn't a data type problem or some other problem that was not allowing the data to pass through. So we had the flag set to yes if there was a discrepancy between the source and the destination features. So some of the challenges that we encountered and some of the things that need to be considered is the data integrity, garbage in, garbage out. So this is one of the ways that FME really helped us out to make sure that we could understand the data, find mistakes in the data, and get around them also using things like the date formatter, the tester, the changing the checking for the data type. If there's a number, character, etc. So I'm on Skype. I didn't even know. Okay. So the other thing that we need to consider is that the data types and the lengths of the data. So if these don't match, FME may have some difficulty transferring data. So that's another thing you need to consider. Domain tables, be careful about data types. If you have little control over any of your data, you can have some errors when you try and put the wrong data type into the right place. And also correct mapping. So make sure that when you're doing your mapping, you don't have any typos, because that can really mess up your validation, obviously. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Alison.
Thank you.
So do you have any questions? I probably have a question. So as far as I understood, you have attributes and geometry stored in separate tables. Were there any benefit?
Why do that?
Yeah. Because it definitely required, I can understand how much workarounds it required to generate those IDs. So were there any?
One of the reasons why you would want to do that is because, for example, if you have a long pipe that is broken with nodes in many different places, with having the geometry stored in a separate table as the attributes, you can have multiple geometries that are all associated with the same pipe, so the same attributes. And you can break up the geometry, but not have to have a million different records for that one pipe.
Oh, that was even one to many rather than one
Yeah,
to one.
exactly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I see.
that's exactly why, to allow one to many. And it also, yeah, we call that a a soft split in the line. So if you split the line, but you don't actually create another another attribute record, it's called a soft split. So that line is all both pieces of that line are associated with the one attribute.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see. Now it's understandable. And I hope you didn't have any serious issues with the date format.
There were a few. There were a few, but FME was able to help with that, like with the testers to see what the date situation was and fix it